even in our sleep. Pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. These words from the ancient Greek poet Aeschylus were famously quoted by Robert Kennedy in his speech announcing the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968. Today, we come together in the aftermath of another unspeakable tragedy, another act of hate and terror that will undoubtedly also leave a lasting scar upon this great nation. For right now, the wound is still fresh. We are only 1 week removed from the events of June 12, 2016, a date that will live in infamy for the rest of our nation's history. We are only 1 week removed from a night when the lives of 49 young people were mercilessly snuffed out. 49 members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community of Orlando, a city barely 2 hours away from this sanctuary. 49 members of the LGBTQ community were taken from us, 53 others injured. It has been only 1 week. In 2016, in this hyper-technological digital age of smartphones and social media networks where information travels around the globe at nearly the speed of light, time feels like it moves faster than it ever has before. So I think it important to remind ourselves that we have had a mere 7 days to grieve, to process, to become acclimated to a post-Orlando massacre America. Very likely, the words we speak today will not be the words we speak a month from now, a year from now, a decade from now. And that's okay. These words are for today, for this time. I don't mind telling you that I struggled mightily to find the appropriate words for today, for this time and this place, this sacred space, this Unitarian Universalist worship service. There will be people today who will find my words too political. Others will find them not political enough. And that's okay too. We all grieve differently. We all handle heartache and tragedy and trauma differently. Some people need more time to hold their sorrow over unspeakable, unimaginable tragedies such as this one. They want and need, if but for a single moment, for that common sorrow to be shared by every human being, by every child of creation, a time to grieve together as one, a time to squarely focus all attention on the victims and their loved ones, a time to honor the dead and the dying. For these people, too quickly politicizing a tragedy such as this, of opportunistically using an event like this as a platform to push a political agenda, profanes a sacred moment in which we should all come together and grieve as one for the shared loss of human life. But for others, the greater part of grief is not necessarily sorrow. It is anger, rage, righteous indignation over a terrible injustice that has led yet again to the unnecessary sacrifice of human life. These people are sick and tired of the moments of silence that lead to nothing. They are sick and tired of the obligatory thoughts and prayers that are offered to loved ones of the victims that lead to nothing. They are sick and tired of empty words that signify nothing. Their anger and grief demand action, some demonstration of human agency to strike against the cold, cruel inertia of our universe. For these people to do nothing, to fail to call for political action while the wound is still fresh, to fail to listen to our hearts, that is the greatest profanity imaginable. So who is right? As a Unitarian Universalist minister, I must look to my own faith for a reply. And the values of my faith remind me that in this universe we all share together, there is rarely ever one right answer to anything. We each grieve in our own way. There is no single right way to do it. So, if I may be so bold as to offer all of you a piece of unsolicited advice this morning, grieve in whatever manner you must. Say what you must say, do what you must do, be what you must be. But remember to be gentle with one another. Remember not to judge others too harshly, because we are all hurting. We are all grieving. We are all working through our sorrow and our rage and our fear. So what to say on the Sunday after this horrific tragedy from the pulpit of a Unitarian Universalist church? What words to use? I am not a journalist, so I see little reason to recite to you all a list of facts about the shooting. There are journalistic sources you can directly access that will be a much better source of information than me. I am not a policy expert on gun control, foreign terrorism, or domestic terrorism. And don't misunderstand me. Our nation's policies on these issues are vitally important, and I believe that our faith calls us to be educated about these policies and fully engaged in the democratic processes that shape these policies so we can do our part to bring them into greater alignment with our deepest held values. But the nuances of these policies are complex, and I will readily admit to you that I am not a better source of information on these policies than experts you can find online, on TV, or in libraries. 1 week after this tragedy, I personally am still gathering information, still reflecting on the details of this horror in an attempt to better understand how our values might best be put into practice and policy so as to ensure that this never happens again. I'm not a journalist. I am not a public policy expert. I'm just a minister leading a worship service on a Sunday morning. I am the servant of a religious community, lifting up the most sacred, the most holy values at the core of our lives, at the core of our existence. So as I see it, my function this morning is to remind us of our shared transcendent values and to help us use those values to make meaning out of an incomprehensible act of violence and hate and terror, a stark reminder that in spite of all our hope and our optimism, which are earmarks of every liberal faith tradition, we still live in a dark and chaotic universe full of unimaginable cruelty and violence. After tragedies like this, for those of us who put our faith in some manner of all-loving God, we are left to ask, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken us? For those of us who have no faith in God and prefer to put our faith in the progress and the goodness of humankind, we are left to wonder if perhaps we're backing the wrong species. A tragedy such as this strikes at the heart of our usual everyday presumptions about what life and existence really ultimately mean. In the aftermath of Orlando, each of us and all of us, we are left with these struggles. And for these great and difficult questions you may be asking yourself right now, I admit I have no answers. But even if I did, what a failure of a pastor I would be if I simply gave them to you. But though I have no answers, that doesn't mean that I have nothing to say. In the midst of our sorrow, our anger, our fear, and our existential disorientation, I think there are at least three things that I can say with confidence this morning. Three things that my still evolving understanding of our faith compels me to say at this time and in this place. First, in all our conversations and remembrances about this incident from now until forever, let us never forget that the primary and most direct victims of this unspeakable tragedy were members of the LGBTQ community. There are some, including leaders in our state and local government, who have seemingly gone out of their way to ensure that all references to this shooting, all condolences, all expressions of grief directed to the city of Orlando specifically make no mention of the LGBTQ community. Now, it may be the case that these individuals who are deleting the letters LGBT and Q in their communications are doing so because they truly believe this attack should be categorized as a case of foreign terrorism, and thus the victims should be considered American before they are considered LGBTQ, and that by downplaying the victims' identities as members of a marginalized population within this country, the circle of empathy from all Americans will actually expand for these victims. But what I really think is more likely is that most of these individuals who just happen to also be staunchly opposed to LGBTQ equality surely know that they will be accused of hypocrisy should they express sympathy toward the victims of a hate crime that proves beyond any shadow of any doubt that the LGBTQ community does in fact face a unique threat of hate and fear and discrimination in our country, and that our public servants are failing them and all of us by not working harder to eliminate those homophobic prejudices. Yes, the victims were all Americans, but they were also LGBTQ. This attack occurred in an LGBTQ nightclub. The 100+ casualties of this attack were members of the LGBTQ community, and so whatever the shooter's intent may have been, it is that community that has suffered a special, specific, and unique harm as a result of this crime. It is a human tragedy. It is an American tragedy. And it is undoubtedly an LGBTQ tragedy. To blatantly and intentionally and repeatedly ignore that fact is either an act of political exploitation or an act of political cowardice, or both. The 49 people who died in that nightclub did not intend to become martyrs. They didn't choose to die for a political cause. All they intended to do, all they chose to do, was to go out and have a good time, to celebrate life. But we, who go on living in the wake of this tragedy, we do have a choice. We can choose to do nothing, or we can choose to act. We can choose to imbue their deaths with some kind of meaning. We can choose to make their deaths the catalyst for a great and monumental change in our society. This morning, I echo the sentiments of Cindy Watson, Executive Director of Jasmine, who urged us at last Sunday's Vigil for Orlando to redouble our efforts to absolutely ensure that Jacksonville passes a fully inclusive human rights ordinance that will protect the rights of our LGBTQ community. Let us as a city make a bold statement that we will not suffer anyone to be treated like a second-class citizen simply because of whom they love or what body they happen to find themselves in. I urge you, write your city council representatives. Write the mayor, email them, call them, let them know that now is the time for change. Let them know that passing a fully inclusive HRO is the strongest, the loudest, the most courageous statement this city can make against all who would seek to terrorize the LGBTQ community. A second statement that I feel necessary to deliver this morning in the wake of this massacre. I believe our faith compels us at this time to reach out and embrace our Muslim brothers and sisters like never before. A week after this tragedy, we still do not know the full extent of the influence that ISIS had on the motives of the shooter. Though we have little available evidence to inform our response, fearmongers have nevertheless already begun broad-scale attacks against the entire Muslim community, thus marginalizing them even further, thus putting them at even further risk of harm. In the wake of this tragedy, fearmongers are pitting Americans against other Americans purely along the lines of race and creed. It is deplorable, and it is un-American. Such actions stand in opposition to every value of Unitarian Universalism. It is bigotry, pure and simple. Every religion, every group has extremists that do not represent the whole. When Dylan Roof shot and killed 9 African-American churchgoers a year ago yesterday in an explicit attempt to start a race war, we know he was not representing all white people. There was no call from the media for all white people in America to make official statements denouncing his act or distancing themselves from his violent white supremacist philosophy. No one was demanding that all white people apologize for Dylan Roof. Why? Because it was presumed he was a mentally unstable splinter extremist. Of course he didn't represent all white people. When Robert Louis Deere Jr. last November shot up a Planned Parenthood in Colorado, there were no calls by the media for every Christian church to issue a statement denouncing his act and distancing themselves from his violent pro-life philosophies. Why? Because it was presumed he was a mentally unstable splinter extremist. Of course he didn't represent all Christians. But when this lone gunman attacked the Pulse in Orlando, the presumption was reversed. Many argued and continue to argue that he was not mentally unstable, that he was a fully sane Muslim terrorist, rationally acting out to its logical end the dictates of his faith. And as a result, we now hear calls from these same fearmongers demanding that Muslims in America and across the world make official statements denouncing the shooter's actions. And then they cross their arms and sit in judgment over those Muslims, judging whether or not their statements of condemnation are strong enough. And no matter how strongly worded the condemnations are, these fearful people, at the behest of certain opportunistic politicians, are now advocating that Muslims be kept under special surveillance and scrutiny both publicly and privately. They seek to pit the good Muslims versus the bad Muslims so that they, all of them, won't threaten our way of life. In this time of fear and anxiety, we must stand courageously on our values, and that means standing with the Muslim community. We must not allow anxiety-ridden Americans and opportunistic politicians to turn back America's clock to the days of Joseph McCarthy. As Unitarian Universalists, as Americans, we must stand against this fear. The third and final message I feel compelled to convey to you today is actually just a small piece of advice I once heard long ago that has always stuck with me. The words have a penchant for coming to my mind when I least expect them, and these words came to mind as I was preparing this sermon last evening. And they come with a short story. The early Christian church fathers told a story of the Apostle John. Now, John was the longest lived of all Jesus' apostles, living well into his 90s, perhaps even longer. Anyway, in his advanced age, when he could no longer deliver full sermons, every week the Apostle John would be brought to church on a stretcher, and he would prop himself up, and he would utter these words, and only these words: "Little children, love one another." Week after week, every week, he delivered the same short homily. Finally, one day, someone asked the apostle, "Why is it that every week you say the same thing? Little children, love one another." And John replied, "Because it is enough." My third and final statement this morning, in the shadow of Orlando, on a morning that I am struggling to find the right things to say, is really just a summary, I think, of everything else I have said this morning. It is the same exhortation that the aged Apostle John delivered to his congregation 2,000 years ago. Little children, love one another, because it is enough. Blessed be.